The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review, Matt Dillahunty versus Braxton Hunter, Does the Christian God Exist? Hi, I posted this video at the beginning of March. We had done it about a week prior to when I posted it, and I guess it's also available on Braxton's YouTube channel as well, so you can see that we posted the same thing. And before I posted the video, I posted a miniature partial review. It doesn't cover the debate in detail, and this one's not going to either. It's going to cover a couple things and then an ancillary subject. But the video that I posted was about sort of the debate itself, but the extra rebuttal that the moderator did, which many people pointed out. I don't have an objection to it. I'm not going to reiterate everything I said in that other video, but it's their event. They can do this. And I think that the extra rebuttal or the closing remarks really undermined the case that Braxton was trying to make. And so if anybody should be upset about it more than me, it would be Braxton, because essentially the moderator just said, yep, you're not going to find evidence of God. Trust your inner voice. Go with your gut, which was my primary objection. One of the things that came up in the debate, though, was that I'm too skeptical, that my standards of evidence are so high that there's functionally nothing that could convince me that God exists. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted to note that my feelings of the debate, and I haven't gone back and rewatched every part of it yet. I'm hypercritical of myself, which is why I love doing these debate reviews, because I get to go back and find not just mistakes my opponent made, but mistakes that I made that we can all correct on. And I will say that while my opening statement hit most of the points that I had wanted to hit coming in there, I don't really like my opening remarks from that debate. I think that there was a better way to do it. And the next time that I debate the subject of, is it rational to accept Christianity? Does the Christian God exist? Anything that's specific about the doctrine of Christianity, I'm going to change my opening slightly. I still am a fan of both the argument from divine hiddenness, that essentially we don't see evidence where we would expect to see evidence. This universe looks nothing like what we would expect if, in fact, the Christian God existed. The second argument that I presented in the opening, and I didn't present either of these in great detail. I just they go by almost as quickly as I'm doing them here. But the second one was the argument from inconsistent revelation, essentially that we have 1,000 denominations or more that identify as Christian, and they disagree on every single point of doctrine and have seemingly forever. And that this is inconsistent with the notion that there is a God with an important message. It would seem that clearing up this message and clearing up the confusion would be a primary concern of a God. And so the fact that people come to different conclusions about what must one do to be saved, both things that are critical to that soteriology, as well as mundane things like can you drink alcohol or not, these aren't as impactful. I have apologist friends who love tequila and love to drink and are fine with it. And they will cite the verses that say, oh, well, there's no real problem with this. And then, I have folks like my parents who are really opposed to drinking alcohol in any form. And they have their verses that they point to. That inconsistent revelation is not essential to the doctrine. It's not like they think, oh, if you have some alcohol, you're going to hell. And that's why I don't tend to address those inconsistent revelations, and instead go to the ones that seem to deal with how we're saved, what we're saved to, what we're saved from, and all these other notions. But there's a third argument against Christianity, which I haven't presented in a debate like this. And it will absolutely be one of those three arguments that I present the next time I debate this. So heads up to anybody who wants to debate Christianity, the divine hiddenness, inconsistent revelation. And the third one will be whether or not there is a soul. And it's because if we have good reason to think that there's no such thing as a soul, which I'm on record as having said the soul is the single most dead concept in all of Christianity, religion, supernaturalism, etc., then clearly Christianity can't be true. But we'll save that for the other debate. Instead, I wanted to talk about a couple other things that happened. One was I wanted in this debate to address as many of the points that my opponent made as possible. And because of the format, essentially he gives his opening remark, I give my opening remark, then he gives a rebuttal, and then I have to essentially rebut the opening and his rebuttal. And so now that's 30 minutes of talking that I have 10 minutes to address, whereas he only has to address 20 minutes in 10. And I get it. That's just the way debates work. It's one of the reasons why I'm pushing for more conversational discussion-based debates where you might give like a 5 or 10-minute opening statement for your position and then a lot of discussion and directed questions, because I think we did not get as much of that in this debate as I would have hoped and as I think other people might have hoped. But what I did do is I took copious notes, and I've got a system by which I will circle the most important ones and actually rank them as I'm going through, so that when I get up, if you listen to my rebuttal in that debate, it is a rapid fire. Here's what's wrong with this. Here's what's wrong with this. We're not going to have time to go into great detail and explain compatibilism, blah, 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 Because what he presented was, first of all, that if there's not a God, there's no libertarian free will. There is libertarian free will, therefore there is God. And that's not correct. I'm doing that off the top of my head. I just spotted a fallacy in that. So if that's what he said, there's another fallacy. But essentially, it is the argument that if we have libertarian free will, then there must be a God. And no matter how the structure of the argument was, the problem for me, which I addressed fairly quickly, is that I do not believe that we have libertarian free will. By the way, this has nothing to do with the political ideology. It is the notion that if you were to rewind time, you could have done something different. That's what libertarian free will is. And as a compatibilist, to whatever extent that still applies, because I had a great discussion with Rationality Rules about free will, and I've pretty much agreed to talk about, I believe that we have will, how free it is up for discussion or debate, but I still am fairly convinced by Dan Dennett's compatibilism that there's nothing about determinism that necessarily eliminates all varieties of free will. But rather than spending any time arguing or discussing how free our will is, it doesn't matter, because even Dan Dennett doesn't believe we have libertarian free will. The vast majority of neuroscientists that I've interacted with that have studied these sorts of things, beginning to see how the brain works, don't think we have libertarian free will. And so my question that I asked that was important was, I don't believe we have free will. How could you possibly demonstrate that we had free will? This particular variety. We are unable to rewind time, so it's an untestable proposition. And I would like to know how somebody goes about determining that we have libertarian free will. And essentially, if you watch the debate, and please correct me if I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly, but there was no evidence for libertarian free will. It was just an assertion by Braxton that he feels like he has it, and it would be absurd to think that he doesn't. Well, that's about what he is or isn't convinced of. And even if he's correct, any reasonable objective observer would have to look at Braxton and say, okay, he's completely convinced that he has libertarian free will and finds it absurd to think that he doesn't. And Matt is absolutely not convinced that we have libertarian free will, and I added, finds it absurd to think that libertarian free will is compatible with the notion of the God that he's talking about. Because if I truly have libertarian free will, then a God couldn't reliably predict my actions in order to make prophecies about things in the future. And so you'd have to get into, what does God know about the future? How reliable is God's knowledge of the future? And you get into apologetics where God is removed from time as if he can see all of reality on like a video recording type thing. So he knows what's going to happen and you still have free will. But the counter to that is, if God created the universe and God knew what was going to happen and God could have created a different universe, then that means, and this was the question I raised, that God picked this particular universe of others. If in some other universe I had exercised my libertarian free will and wound up as a Southern Baptist preacher, and in this one I exercised my libertarian free will and ended up as an atheist, if God specifically picked the universe in which he knew I was going to exercise my free will in this way, then I didn't have free will. God specifically chose the universe in which I become an atheist. This is a problem. And so Braxton's response to it was essentially, maybe there was no viable universe under which you, through the characteristics, meaning me, Matt, under the characteristics of my brain, would have chosen a different path. It's not that I couldn't, it's that I wouldn't. And I get that. And there's nothing wrong with that response, other than it's just another unfounded assertion. He can't demonstrate this at all. It is an ad hoc hypothesis in an attempt to explain away a real problem. So to the extent that we're able to investigate this notion of free will at all, we have no evidence for it, an assertion that it's absurd to think we don't have it, and that maybe God, in every universe that God could have created, I would not have chosen to follow or continue following Christ. But that's just an ad hoc way of dismissing the objection. It's not an answer to anything. And so looking at it, we have a completely untestable scenario here. The other two arguments that Braxton presented, a version of the Kalam, which is problematic because it doesn't get to Christianity. So we could have just skipped past that and said that essentially Braxton's convinced there had to have been a creator, and he's going to call that creator the Christian God. And the third one was about the resurrection. And quite honestly, unless I'm misremembering, I don't know that there was actually much evidence presented for the resurrection. What was presented, to my recollection, was more about the claims about the resurrection. And the claims aren't evidence. The claims are the claims. You need additional evidence for that. And this is how we get to this notion that Matt's just too skeptical, which is what I wanted to address now. On many occasions, I've been accused of being too skeptical, of having standards of evidence that are just too high. And the truth is, I set my standards of evidence such that they help prevent me from being incorrectly convinced of things. That's the purpose of skepticism, to have as many true beliefs and as few false beliefs as possible. And so you need to have the sort of evidence for a proposition that distinguishes it from other candidate explanations. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, I wouldn't be convinced of a God until God comes down here and stands in front of me and demonstrates the truth of his existence. And in fact, I've pointed out that that's something that God could and potentially should do if he wanted to convince me, but that's not what my standard of evidence is. In truth, what I've repeatedly been pointing out for nearly a decade is that I have no idea what would convince me, but if there's a God, that God should know what would convince me and should be capable of doing so. And the fact that this hasn't happened means that either that God doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists. And I have to add the word yet, because I'm being as honest as I can about all this. But when people present the evidence for their God, and I say that I find it unconvincing, to say that my standards of evidence are too high, well, that's a claim that we could actually address. What standards of evidence should there be? How do you distinguish between an incredibly advanced alien technology and God? If I can't tell the difference, then I am stuck and cannot demonstrate what sort of evidence would or should convince me which one of those two candidate explanations is likely to be true. Apart from, we have an incredibly massive universe. There's nothing that rules out other sentient life, and there's nothing that rules out other life that's more advanced. And yet we have and we found the building blocks of life elsewhere in the universe. The Drake equation shows how likely it might be that there could be other civilizations. I don't think that they're visiting Earth or involved in Earth in any sense. Sorry to all the alien pyramid builders. I don't know. I love Stargate, but come on, it's science fiction. That's not particularly compelling to people when you say, I don't know. I don't know what evidence would convince me. And they say, well, your standards are too high. How can my standards possibly be too high if my answer is, I don't know? Show me what evidence convinced you and why it convinced you and how it's distinguished from the same evidence being used for other candidate explanations. After all, if your position is just God did it, you still got all your work to do to figure out which God did it. Was it the God of the Abrahamic religions? And by the way, does that mean that the Jews are right, or the Hindus are, the Muslims are right, or the Christians are right? You still got to sort all that out. Was it some Hindu God? Was it some other supernatural event? There's a lot of work to do to distinguish between all these candidate explanations. And the reason those candidates exist is because they're essentially, there's no way to show that they're false. And so the better answer for me is I have no idea what the actual explanation is for the origin of the universe. None. I just am waiting for somebody to say, here's the explanation for the origin of the universe, and this is how I know it, in such a way that it is convincing. We have good understandings for various things, but there are lots of questions that we don't have answers for. Now, they think that what I'm looking for is every single step in the chain because they're the ones that actually often have two different standards of evidence. And what I mean by them having two different standards of evidence, I mean that they have two different standards of evidence with respect to similar claims. I have countless standards of evidence. You want to convince me you got a pet dog, I'm probably just going to take you at your word because the risk of being wrong is negligible. I know there's dogs. I know people have them as pets. Congratulations, you're awesome. And if I find out that I'm wrong, then the biggest thing that has to change is how much I trust you in the future. But when we're talking about different standards of evidence for claims like whether or not there's a God, or whether God created life, or whether or not the diversity of life is explained by evolution, in the case of evolution, we have mountains of physical evidence, including not only fossils, but DNA, and the geology bears out, and you have this mass of evidence that works together to confirm that our understanding of the diversity of life, current explanations, are the most reasonable and the best supported. Whereas the people who oppose evolution, have dismissed all of the science in favor of something that does not have that standard of evidence. It's not like there's fossil evidence, DNA evidence, and all this stuff for a God, and it outweighs what we have for evolution. Instead, there's virtually no reliable, there's no scientific evidence, but there are anecdotal claims and testimonials and things like that, but that shouldn't outweigh the bulk of scientific discovery about this. And so it's not that I'm looking for every little detail that would lead to the conclusion that a God exists. The truth is that I have a standard of evidence that's going to be commensurate with how extraordinary the claim is. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that there's a God is incredibly extraordinary, that he exists outside of space-time is extraordinary, that he has the power and ability to create everything is extraordinary. If you don't think that's extraordinary, I think we have to take a step back and have a conversation about extraordinary claims. Now, one of the arguments that was not presented in the debate, but which has been common, is the watchmaker argument, that if you're walking along a beach and you find a watch, you know that this watch had a designer. That's correct. And the counter that Dennis LeBay taught me years ago was that the theist is walking along a beach of watches, certainly a universe of watches, and is picking up one watch and saying this one was clearly designed, because they think that the sand and the beach and the water and everything else was designed too. And it gets to the heart of this. We recognize design by contrasting it with nature. But there's another example with this watch that I think might demonstrate a little bit of the problem with people's standards of evidence. Because if I showed you several pictures of my watch, which I'm not wearing, and it had, the time on the watch said 2:10, 2:12, 2:13, 2:14. And I said, look, here's some pictures of my watch. You can infer that my watch is running. Well, they might say, yes, but you skipped 2:11. So we don't have every single step in that chain. Oh, I found a picture with the watch at 2:11. Yes, but there's a second hand as well. And so you haven't shown every second hand in this transition. Well, what if I found those? Well, for all I know, you could be manually setting your watch to those times and then taking pictures. And you know what? They're right. That is a possible candidate explanation for pictures of a watch at different times. What if I set my watch next to a whole bunch of clocks in like a clock museum and took the pictures and showed that they were all moving? Now, is it likely that I'm going around setting every one of them? Well, it's not impossible, but I don't know that that actually, demonstrates a real problem here, because the next step is to say, well, you have no explanation for how that watch changes over time. So I can take the back off the watch and I can show you the mechanism, and we can see that this mechanism, while different from the clock next to it, is at least similar in some regards. We can investigate how and why it works. And we can build all this up to show that this is a particular mechanical device that is constructed specifically to keep time. And we build up a case to where it's more plausible our watch was keeping time and that I was merely taking pictures of it than that I was manually adjusting things along the way. Now, what about the mechanism? Okay, this is where many Christians and creationists and apologists are like, he's using a watch, and a watch is clearly designed. You're correct, I am. But it's an analogy, and the purpose of an analogy is to show the underlying reasoning, not the specifics. And so when we find diversity of life, we begin filling in the gaps in the fossil record. Oh, well, that's not enough. Okay. And then later on, we find a mechanism, DNA, a self-replicating, naturally occurring process of replicating the genetic code. So we have a mechanism. Oh, well, that mechanism is not enough on its own to account for the diversity. God must have tinkered. And the truth is that as they go through this, they have a standard of evidence for God, which is incredibly low. And yet they want to place a standard of evidence on evolution or the origins of the universe or whatever else they might be doing that is higher than that, because this is their prior belief, the belief that there is a God, and this God can account for everything. So while it may be reasonable to infer things based on observations, to dismiss reasonable observations based on a previously held belief that you can't demonstrate. You can't demonstrate that God tinkered with evolution or DNA. You can't demonstrate that God is tinkering in any way. It's all a suspicion. It's an inference. It's a rely on your inner voice and trust your suspicions. If you have a religious belief that conflicts with the observations and you favor the religious belief, then the evidence for that religious belief and the standards of evidence for it must in fact be higher and met than the competing proposition. So when people say, Matt, you're just too skeptical, first of all, I don't think you can be too skeptical. Skepticism is a toolkit for making sure that you are less likely to believe false things and more likely to believe true things. It's not proclamations about absolute truth. It has no bias in the sense that it's not prohibiting the notion that there's a God out there. It's recognizing that all these claims about a God have failed to meet a standard of evidence that would be justified, or that would have us be justified in believing this. That's what skepticism is. You can be cynical. You can just be like, nope, I'm not believing that. Or you can have misapplied standards of evidence such that you wind up believing one thing and disbelieving something else unfairly. But of the people in that debate, I would argue that I'm not the one that has mismatched standards of evidence. I'm convinced that evolution is the current best explanation for the diversity of life on Earth because there's monumental evidence for it. The mechanism is known and understood. But you can't explain how life arose. You haven't solved abiogenesis. Correct. That doesn't change the fact. What is it that we could discover about abiogenesis that would undermine the bulk of the scientific evidence such that we would find evolutionary theory is wrong? That's the thing. There were examples of, how could you falsify it? And famous examples of, finding fossilized rabbits in the Precambrian come to mind. That would be a problem, assuming it was more than just an outlier or a hoax or whatever else. But if you're following the evidence where it leads, you don't run into that problem. So when people say I'm too skeptical, I don't know how that's possible unless I'm just flatly denying stuff. And as the person who sat there on stage and pointed out and even got called out by an audience member because I would not dogmatically assert there was no God, and instead my position was the claim that there is a God hasn't met its burden of proof, and the people who are accepting this essentially have lowered standards of evidence for God, that they're not being skeptical enough, and they're the ones that have inadequate, inaccurate, and inconsistent standards of evidence. And that's the real problem. Truth is the way it is. And in many ways, what they're doing is pretending that they're reasonable when they're not. And the reason it doesn't feel that way is because they may be eminently reasonable about all sorts of things that don't have anything to do with their religion. Where their religion comes in conflict with the findings of science, if they prioritize that religious belief, which has inferior evidence, over the findings of science, which has massively superior evidence, they're the ones with the inadequate standards of evidence, not me. And if what they believe fails to meet up to reasonable standards of evidence, that's a problem with their claim and not my methodology. Simply saying Matt's too skeptical and Matt's standards of evidence are too high is not in any way a rebuttal, because it is functionally identical to my standards of evidence for God are significantly lower than Matt's. Congratulations. Now we understand why we disagree. If you explore your standards of evidence and show that they are in fact reliable, you might change my mind. But in countless debates over the years, every time this subject has reared its ugly head, instead of providing the evidence that would convince me that their standard of evidence is good, they just instead say, Matt's too skeptical. I will continue to be too skeptical to suit the religious people, probably, I'm guessing, for the rest of my life. But I'm open to changing that just as soon as they come up with something better than saying my standards of evidence are just too high. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.